All right, welcome to the ICS Radio Hour half hour with Dwayne and Eric. I think today, Dwayne, we are probably going to do something that I think I'm going to coin for now and call a rantisode, uh, which probably isn't ranting, and it's probably not really an episode. It's somewhere in between those two. Are you going to learn something? Maybe. Are you going to get angry? Maybe. Are you going to think differently at the end of it? That's what we hope so. So here's what I think we should talk about today, and you tell me whether or not this is worth your time. So I was made my way down to Sands ICS in Orlando a couple weeks ago. It was a great time. Met a lot of cool people, listened to some good ideas, saw some of the luminaries, as they like to say, in our ICS security space give their talks, and actually really enjoyed a lot of them. Which I was fully coming in expecting to maybe think that they were blowing a little hot air, but it actually was great. So one of the luminaries got up and spoke and said the following, which would be the topic of today. And they said the following. Hey, I think you've probably heard the following from a million people in OT or IT security. In IT, everything is CIA, confidentiality, integrity, or sorry, confidentiality. Oh no, Dwayne, we'll start over again. That was awful.
No, don't start over. Just own your mistake. Go.
Own my mistake. Anyway, CIA, and in OT, it's AIC. And everyone says that, and everybody thinks and believes it's 100% true. And I thought about it for a while, Dwayne, and I said, maybe not. Maybe it's not. And I think that person is probably right. So that's what I want to talk about today. Is it CIA or is it AIC? Why or why not? And who's wrong and who's right? How about
Oh,
that?
this is perfect. Well, look, first of all, as much as I deplore agreeing with any so-called luminary in any setting or particular, I would say maybe that person's right. I'm sure if I heard it in detail, I would argue some portion just because that's my way. But let's yeah, let's deconstruct that first from the IT side, right? Because I always like to, or I feel like I often speak to, hey, we should borrow from IT what we can, and we should make our own path where we should. So let's start off with the dumbness of CIA before we talk about the dumbness of AIC. How's that sound?
Sounds good to me.
So yeah, and part of that, I think we certainly could. I don't want to spend a half hour splitting hairs. Confidentiality, absolutely. You've got data, you've got to protect that data. That's important. Integrity, that's the same thing, right? Is it worse to lose the data, or is it worse to have the database corrupted and you don't know any better? And again, you could argue that for hours, but they're kind of the same thing. Again, you could argue, but integrity, okay, yeah, you got to make sure the stuff isn't snooped on and blah 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 blah. Availability, and I think that's the one that we want to spend a minute on, is okay, what does that even mean in the context of either environment? And therefore then what do, and then again, I think availability is what we're really going to hone in on the ICS side. So is availability, hey, how bad does it hurt the business when Maggie can't get her email for a half hour? I mean, arguably that's pretty bad, but what does availability mean in the IT space, right?
What is going to truly happen? Yeah,
Yeah.
I can't log into my bank account and make a transfer for 30 minutes. What's going to happen? Yeah,
Yeah. I
I
mean,
might have to log in 30 more minutes and do it.
right. And you ifs, ands, or buts, right? But the other end of that spectrum is, hey, what happens if Amazon goes down and you can't order your baby wipes? Well, do you go somewhere else to order them, or is that lost revenue, or isn't it? I don't know, and I don't care for at least for the today's topic. I mean, you hear, hey, ransomware, we got a ransomware hit and it was millions of dollars that we lost. It's like, okay, well, you lost millions of dollars worth of money because you hired incompetent employees last week. I mean, what's the difference? You've also saved billions of dollars since you went down this goofy world of information security and information technology in the 1970s. There's always been stuff that's broken, and there's always stuff that'll cost you money. I don't know. Does that sound weird or Luddite? Maybe,
Maybe.
but yeah. Okay, but I'm setting up for the OT conversation, so I'll stop there for a minute.
All right, so let's do the OT conversation then. So everybody says flip it on its head. Availability, as we've discussed, is always the most important thing, right? And I would agree with that in some points, but I'd also disagree with it in some points because, in my experience, and Dwayne, you're probably going to agree with this one, is in certain industries availability is the key, and it is the key, and it is the lock linchpin of everything, right? Power, water, things like that, right? You have to stay on for various reasons, right?
Mhm.
We Lord knows I lived in Houston for a very long time, and I learned the lessons of what happens when the power goes out or the water goes out.
Yeah.
Things don't go well for anybody. Um, but yeah, I think for the majority of the world that uses true OT systems, I think it's not necessarily availability as in 100%. It's availability when I care about it, which I think is a different methodology and mindset, right? In manufacturing, and Joanne, this is where I'd like your opinion on this one. What I see a lot is that they have a run and they'll say, hey, we're going to run for 6 hours and we need the plant up and running for those 6 hours. And when the raw material is done, when the milk is turned into ice cream, when the steel runs out, when we've got all the parts bent or whatever we're doing, hey, availability now has rocketed down to zero, if not negative zero, because we're not doing anything anymore, right?
Yeah. Well, I've got so many things to answer to that, and I'm probably going to lose part of them as I try to answer. But let's be clear on a couple things. I mean, shit goes down all the time, right? I mean, I've walked into the classic example that's used all the time. I've walked into automotive manufacturing plants where the line was stopped and nobody's running, nobody's hair is on fire. And the person I was interacting with, it was of course a cybersecurity person. I said, "Hey, what's up?" He's like, I don't know. All I know is it's not my fault. And that's all he cared about, right? He didn't break anything, or his team didn't break anything. So, And look, that happens all the time. And salespeople in particular, no offense, Eric, will go into a customer and yell, "Hey, downtime costs $8 billion per second here. We've got to make sure we protect against downtime." It's like, eh. I mean, that happens all the time. And is that lost money, lost revenue? Of course it is. But let's not pretend it's more important than it really is. And I guess depending on your job there, you're going to argue or yell at me. But what it really comes down to for most of the people I know is they don't want to cause that downtime, right? That downtime happens all the time. And when we talk about availability, we talk CIA, AIC, IAC, whatever, and your luminary dude, right? It's not, here's what we've gotten into because so many people write so much bullshit out on the internet is it's not an ordered list. Let me say that again. It's not an ordered list. It's all important, right? Is availability more important than confidentiality or integrity? Well, I'll say the classic one you hear all the time. To Coca-Cola, and confidentiality is pretty important to the manufacturing of their soda pop, right? They want that very well protected when it comes to the recipe. So absolutely. The other one that just galls me that's not on there is safety. if you listen to most of, you said it, manufacturing, but it kind of doesn't matter. Certainly electrical utilities is very important. Is safety. Safety is paramount above everything else.
Yeah.
Because you want your employees or your coworkers or whatever to go home at night. I mean, all right, I'll stop ranting about that and rant about something else. So it's what's the other way people say it, right? It's a stool, it's a three-legged stool, right? If you don't have integrity, if something happens or confidentiality, it's probably going to affect availability. If you get hit with ransomware, that's not an availability problem, that's a cybersecurity problem that affects availability. What we always get into is when I make changes, when I apply a control, I don't want to break something, right? That's the longest standing manufacturing attitude that there ever was. That's why we get these, 90-year-old ICS systems that nobody will breathe on because it's working today.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Does any of that mean anything? I went around in a circle, I think. So
I think you went around in a circle, but I think it was illuminating multiple points that are decent. And I think going back to the 90-year-old thing is actually a decent spot to talk about for a second, which is, hey, 90 years is pretty good availability in terms of availability, right? If you've
yeah,
got something running for that long. Now, arguably, was confidentiality or integrity ever a thing in 90 years ago? Probably not.
yeah,
Like you probably, the stamper or whatever that's now run by an old decrepit PLC, probably the thing that was you're protecting your confidentiality is a mold. That's a physical thing, right? Couldn't
yeah,
take it away, right? Which I think is interesting to say. Maybe in OT, like you said, all of it matters, but also we shouldn't be putting labels on these things, right? We should just talk about the system as a whole, right? And the process as a whole, and
mhm,
not worry about talking about the intricacies of one or the other or something else like that, right? Because I think it's interesting in that the system as a whole, the process as a whole, the 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 way that we think about how these systems run on a day-to-day basis. When you talk to an actual process engineer or a chemical engineer, they're not thinking about the IT ramifications of things. They're just thinking about, hey, what am I trying to get done with this system? What's the mechanical engineer saying? Well, we got to do X step one, step two, step three, step four, step five. And at the end of step five, now step six is a finished product. Or,
mhm.
hey, chemical engineer says, turn here, take these raw molecules, heat them up, spin them around, cool them down, run them through a pipe, blast them with something else, and then at the end of it, you get the ending chemical reaction and the ending quality, molecule that you want. At
Yeah.
no point in any of those situations did they talk about any of those three letters, right? They just talked
Ah,
about the process.
no, and I think again that it becomes an ordered list because that is certainly how they look at the world is it is important to me as an engineer that that process works and works reliably. And when I say reliably, I mean as trouble free and as constantly as it can, right? Now, when you talk about, you talked about a couple important things there. Is one of them is I'm making a chemical, no matter what it is, it's quite often it's a distillation or it's whatever. I may not be making the same thing all the time every time. So I run it, I turn some valves or I do something that makes it change into something else, and then I run it again for a while. And hopefully I didn't open or close the wrong valve, right? I mean, you've told me stories about that before. And I think it's continuous processing where you're 24/7 one thing versus setup, then run, then set up, then run. And that has to be reliable. But those all then still come down to the other legs of the stool or whatever dumb analogy you want to apply to that, right?
Sure. Well, and it's interesting now that brings up another interesting idea is that are there almost, not to take the world and split it into more hairs, but are we talking about multiple types of OT? Is there the is there the OT that is supposed to be available, and there's the OT that is not always supposed to be available, right? Again, think of the power or think of the water. The water and the power generally need to stay on all the time.
Mhm. Yeah.
Is that a different OT? Maybe we should be talking about, maybe we should be splitting the world and hey, we create another industry. There's critical OT and there's intermittent OT, right? Like it's an interesting thought that I had while I was listening to that guy talk, which was like, again, it's availability when it matters, but maybe we're talking about different things, right?
Well, I mean, look, I won't name the names, but I spent some time selling into the electrical power industry, and one of my customers said directly to me, is like, yeah, every time I go home and I switch on that light, I'm amazed that the lights go on. It's like, wow, that scares me. But when you think about how, so that's certainly a very specific, vertical that we do rely on to, everything, right? And it is scary to think about what happens if the lights go off. There's hundreds of fictional books that sound real good and scary about that, right? But I won't go into that, but to say, yeah, I've certainly been to customers that I worked with whatever generics you want to say, large beverage maker, right? And they had a ransomware incident. Their PCs were all locked up. They were still making beverages. They were scared to death because they had to then walk around and back up all the PCs or PLCs, sorry, manually. And they spent lots of money doing that. But yeah, I mean, it was still making the product. They just couldn't see any of it, do anything about it. I mean, the latest one, look, everything I know about it is from reading in the paper, but it's like the pipeline, right? The incident with the pipeline. Their issue was they couldn't bill anybody. They could have still pushed petrol down that pipeline.
Well, yeah, it was this was another actually large topic at Sans ICS, which was like, yeah, it was a little bit of that, but it was also like, hey, we don't know exactly what product is exactly where it is in the
Right.
pipeline, right? So they didn't want to pump, airplane fuel into somebody's car, right?
It'll still run.
That's just you pay extra for that.
Yeah. But no, I guess again, it comes down to let's not, the problem is like almost everything else is we're getting a little too excited about acronyms and people that may or may not have a lot of background or ability to speak on these things. And then they've just, what's the word? Echo chamber, right? Everybody says, well, it's not CIA, it's AIC. It's, you know what? It's not anything. What is most important to you? Sit down and figure out what's most important to you. Does the money printing machine have to run as much as possible? Yes. Should you, you and I visit a customer, right? They had an extremely old set of controllers running a multi-million-dollar, a day, a week, who knows, business. It was all old slick fives, right? And it was ancient. And, and I didn't say this to my customer, and hopefully they're not listening. Why you've obviously saved billions of dollars over the lifetime of this system. Why is there not a financial model that says, here is the end of life of this system, and here is where we're going to spend money? Instead, and like many of our customers, it was, I'll never be able to go get the money it takes to replace this. Take a little bit of that money that you're saving every year through the automation of the whatever process it is, put it aside, and when it dies, when it's old, replace it. We've all worked in industry. If you work in the IT industry, Cisco's bread and butter was that we end-of-lifed everything every 5 weeks, and the customer went crazy and went and bought whole new networking systems because we weren't going to support that thing anyway. Maybe it was more than 3 weeks, but you get my point, right? Hey, every 5 years we replace our entire network. That's not how it works in an ICS, right? Or an
Well,
OT.
and people would flip out, like you said.
But it should work as to, look, there's a security issue with running end of life product. It's all totally aside the fact that you have to go buy the shit on eBay because nobody makes it anymore. It's there's a security issue because nobody writes new software for that. And, I'm sure that's going to cause a lot of people to reel back in horror and tell me all the ways I'm wrong. But replace the shit every 20 years. How about that?
Fair enough.
All right, I probably digressed even more. What was the point? AIC? Yeah. Um, Maybe use that as a starting point, add in safety, and figure out what's important to you.
There you go. Rank it importantly, and then you can have a educated but also specific conversation about what's important, where what matters. Which, by the way, is the thing that we talked about maybe last time, and we'll continue to talk about for a
I'm
very long
sure we
time.
will.
Which
Well,
is know your system.
know your system. I think again that, and look, there's again a lot of things you could go read on the internet. Is guys that look more like me than you are retiring and leaving the industry, and out the door goes all that tribal knowledge, right? And
Hmm.
so maybe go figure out what's going on first. Maybe figure out how the system works. And when it comes to, when you look even at CIA or whatever set of acronyms you want to use, none of that even touches the idea of this is what is the most important thing in InfoSec? That I mean, a lot of people would agree the most important thing is InfoSec is data classification, right? I mean, again, we could have a whole argument about that, but it comes down to, and I'll use the same example again, if you're Coca-Cola, data classification, what's more important, your recipe for making those products or your accounts receivable? All right, I'm oversimplifying, obviously. Same thing in any OT environment is I use this example all the time, so you've heard it, but I mean, is running the kiln or the furnace that builds steel or glass or whatever, is that more important, or is it some low-speed conveyor on the other side of the plant? Well, from a safety, hopefully you can see that from a safety perspective, that's extremely important that we don't let the kiln overheat and have a kinetic reaction. And B, that's more important to productivity as well. So there's a classification to the systems as well, and how you treat those systems and protect them is very different than how you treat, a 2 mile an hour conveyor belt. Or you get my point,
I
right?
get your point. Yeah. Again, your system speaks to you and tells you what's important about it, not the
Right.
other way around.
So that's not a I'll go back into, one of the things we hear all the time. That's not a corporate infosec minion coming in and saying, well, you've got all these vulnerabilities on a PC. You've got to take some control over prioritization. You've also got to work with the other side of the group to say, yeah, maybe this is important. And maybe when we talk about availability has to do with, ransomware, all this scary quasi-military threat actor bullshit you hear. But some of it's true, and you do have to protect it. I don't know. Does that help anybody? Maybe, maybe not. But I guess ignore those dumb things about AIC, but build your own path. And maybe that's what I'm saying. I don't know.
Have an opinion about your stuff. Know your systems. Know your world, and know why it's important and why it's
Yeah.
not important.
But figure out what to do. I guess the other thing too, if we're winding down here, and it feels like we are, it's not this, right? It's not don't touch my stuff. It's not get away from me. It's, you know, take what you can from IT, take what you can from good processes, good people, and understand that there is an actual threat just because it hasn't happened to you. There is an actual issue. There is a goodness to actually understanding what your systems do and documenting that, and quit acting, quit hoarding information because you think it protects your job, because it actually is probably the complete opposite of that. And I know that was way off in this left field, but okay.
If nobody knows how to run the thing, your availability's gone to zero anyway. So there you go.
Yeah.
And if you can't teach anyone how to do it, you're even worse off.
Yeah. So maybe is that the ending of
I
the,
think that was a pretty good rant episode. I think that was good, short, compact. I think we put some good points up. I think we made some
well,
opinions.
let's hopefully maybe ask right before we sign off here for people to give us their opinions. So if that was kind of a valuable kind of thing, let us know.
Heck,
And
you can come on and do a rant-episode with us. I'd love to hear
yeah,
a reverse rant-episode.
sounds good. All right. Thanks, everybody.